Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Have you ever noticed how one little detail can change everything you thought you knew about something?
Yeah, totally. It's like finding a missing piece of a puzzle. It's wild how those little connections can completely shift your perspective.
And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. One of these little details that has some big implications, especially if you're interested in the origins of the Book of Mormon.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, so we're going to be diving deep into this fascinating idea that a Bible commentary from the 1800s, written by this guy named Adam Clarke, might have actually influenced the Book of Mormon.
Right, and specifically, we're going to be zeroing in on the book of Isaiah. There are all these textual parallels between how Adam Clarke interpreted Isaiah and how it shows up in the Book of Mormon.
Which, raises some really interesting questions, like, was Joseph Smith really translating ancient golden plates?
Mm.
Or was he maybe, drawing on ideas that were already floating around in his time?
Right. And we're also going to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're like the oldest copies of Isaiah we have, and they paint a really different picture.
Yeah, so this is going to be a fun one. So first things first, who is Adam Clarke?
Adam Clarke was kind of a big deal back in the day. I mean, we're talking early 1800s. He was this Methodist scholar, super into languages. Seriously, the guy knew a ton of ancient languages.
Oh, wow.
And his Bible commentary, which he started publishing around 1810, was this massive project, years and years of work. And here's the thing. It was everywhere in America during Joseph Smith's time. You could find it in different formats, different prices. It wasn't some obscure, hard-to-find text.
So accessible then.
Very accessible.
So anyone interested in the Bible could have potentially read it and gotten into his interpretations and his ideas.
That's the point.
Now let's talk about the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith claimed he started translating it from these golden plates in 1829, right? The traditional story is that these golden plates contained this ancient record.
Prophets in the Americas, all that.
Yeah. And he used a seer stone to translate them, dictating to scribes who wrote it all down.
Yeah.
And of course, the official view is that it was like a direct divine translation.
But that's where things get interesting.
Exactly. So what we're doing today is looking into this alternative idea, this idea that Joseph Smith maybe wasn't just translating, but that he was actually using Adam Clarke's commentary as a source.
Right. And like we said, we're focusing on the book of Isaiah because that's where a lot of the really compelling parallels are.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Isaiah stuff, I think it's helpful to understand what was going on in the world of biblical scholarship back in the early 1800s. What was the religious climate like?
Okay, so picture this. It's the early 1800s, and there's this growing sense among a lot of Protestants that the Bible, as it existed then, wasn't quite, perfect.
They weren't happy with it.
Right. There was this idea that over the centuries, it had gotten corrupted. And some of this was tied to anti-Catholic sentiment. They felt the Catholic Church had messed with the scriptures.
So there was suspicion.
Tons of suspicion. And you have to remember, this is a time when people are really starting to question authority, especially religious authority.
Right. Makes sense.
So they're calling for a return to what they saw as primitive Christianity. They wanted to get back to the original pure form of the faith.
Okay, so there was this sense of wanting a more authentic, a more original Bible.
Exactly. And to really get this, we need to think about some of the big names of the time, like Alexander Campbell.
Oh, yeah, he was a huge figure.
Hugely influential. He was smack dab in the middle of all these religious debates happening in the 1820s, and he was pushing for some major changes in how people understood the Bible and organized churches. And some scholars, they actually think that these very debates, they might have played a role in the creation of the Book of Mormon.
How so?
Because the Book of Mormon, in a way, offered answers to a lot of the theological questions people were wrestling with back then. It was this new revelation that spoke directly to their concerns.
That's so interesting, this idea that it wasn't just this out-of-the-blue thing, but it was actually engaged with what was happening in the religious world at the time.
Yeah, the Book of Mormon didn't appear in a vacuum.
Right. It makes so much sense. Okay, so we have this backdrop of biblical scrutiny, a desire for a purer form of Christianity and all these debates happening.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Joseph Smith and his people, they weren't completely oblivious to biblical scholarship, right? They actually used commentaries.
Absolutely. And we know this thanks to some really solid research by Seth Perry. He published this paper in 2018 where he showed that early Mormons, including Joseph Smith himself, were using Thomas Scott's Bible commentary in their writings.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and this was in the Lectures on Faith, which were produced just a few years after the Book of Mormon. So it's pretty clear that they were familiar with commentaries, they used them, and they even incorporated ideas from them into their own theology.
So it wasn't like commentaries were this foreign thing to them.
Not at all. Plus, in Colby Townsend's research, which we'll talk about more later, he mentions a direct reference to Adam Clarke. So they knew about him. At least some of them did.
Okay, so they were reading commentaries, they were aware of Adam Clarke. So now, let's finally get to the book of Isaiah. This is where things get really fascinating. Tell me about this Isaiah problem that scholars always talk about. What's that all about?
So the Book of Mormon, it quotes a lot from Isaiah, but here's the problem. Scholars have known for a long time that the Book of Isaiah, as we have it today, wasn't all written by the same person. Like, the latter part of it, chapters 40 through 66, most likely comes from a different author, or maybe even multiple authors, writing much later than the original Isaiah, who lived in the 8th century BC.
Wait, so the book of Isaiah is like a compilation of different writers.
Exactly. And the later section, it's often called Deutero-Isaiah.
Okay, so that's the Isaiah problem.
Well, that's part of it. The other part is that the Book of Mormon treats all of Isaiah, including Deutero-Isaiah, as if it was all written by the same ancient prophet.
Oh, I see. So that creates a potential issue if you believe the Book of Mormon is like a direct, uncorrupted translation of an ancient record.
Right. It means there would have to be some explanation for how this later material ended up in the Book of Mormon. And here's something else that's really important. The Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon, they mostly use the language of the King James Version of the Bible. You know, the one from the 1600s.
Right.
And it even includes some of the translation mistakes that are in the KJV.
So if the Book of Mormon came from these ancient golden plates, how come it sounds so much like a 17th century English translation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that scholars have been trying to answer for a while now. Some scholars, like Spar and Vest from BYU, they think that maybe Joseph Smith actually had a KJV Bible open in front of him while he was dictating the Isaiah parts.
So instead of translating from the golden plates, he was just reading from the Bible.
Well, it's not quite that simple. The idea is that he might have been using the KJV as a guide, but maybe also changing it in places, adding things, taking things out. But that would explain why the language is so similar and why those KJV mistakes show up.
Okay, so that's where Adam Clarke comes in, right?
Yeah.
How does his commentary connect to all of this?
This is where Colby Townsend's research is so groundbreaking. He recently published this article in the Journal of the Bible and its Reception, and in it, he introduces this concept of textual dependency.
What does that mean?
So basically, he's looking for these unique phrases and wordings, these little quirks of language that appear both in Adam Clarke's commentary on Isaiah and in the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages.
So like specific ways of phrasing things that are distinctive to Adam Clarke.
Exactly. And Townsend found a bunch of them. And he makes this really strong case that these aren't just coincidences. Like, these phrases are too specific, too unique to just happen to show up in both places by chance. And here's the kicker. He couldn't find those same phrases in any other English commentary on Isaiah that was available before 1830. So Clarke's commentary stands out as this potential source for those Isaiah passages.
Wow, that's pretty convincing. Can you give me some examples of these parallels, these little linguistic fingerprints that link the Book of Mormon to Adam Clarke?
Sure. So let's start with Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6. The KJV translates it as, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb." Now, in his commentary, Adam Clarke actually suggests a different way of translating this verse, based on his study of Greek and other ancient manuscripts. He says it should be, "Then shall the wolf be."
Okay, so a slight change, but a meaningful one.
Right. And guess what? In the Book of Mormon, in 2 Nephi 30, verse 12, it's translated as, "And then shall the wolf dwell."
So it follows Clarke's suggestion.
Exactly. It's using that same specific phrasing, "Then shall the wolf." And to make things even more interesting, this change that Clarke suggests, it's not supported by the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So the oldest copies of Isaiah we have don't back up Clarke's interpretation.
Nope. They're more in line with the traditional Hebrew text. So that raises the question, Why does the Book of Mormon seem to be following a 19th century scholar's interpretation that isn't supported by some of the oldest biblical manuscripts?
Hmm, that's a really good question. And there's even an inconsistency within the Book of Mormon itself, right? Because in 2 Nephi 21, which also quotes from Isaiah 11, it uses the KJV phrasing, "The wolf also shall dwell." So within the same book, you have two different versions of the same verse, one following Clarke and one following the KJV.
Exactly. And that inconsistency, it's kind of hard to square with the idea of a perfect, divinely inspired translation, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely makes you wonder, okay, so that's just one example. What are some other parallels that Townsend found?
Okay, here's another one. In 2 Nephi 30, there's this extra verse that's added in the middle of the Isaiah 11 quote. It's not in the regular text of Isaiah, and it's not even in the other Book of Mormon quote of Isaiah 11 and 2 Nephi 21.
So where did it come from?
Well, Townsend noticed something really interesting. The language and the ideas in that added verse, they're very similar to these cross-references to other parts of the Bible, like Psalms, Malachi, and Job, that you find on the same page of Adam Clarke's commentary where he's talking about Isaiah 11.
So it's like Joseph Smith might have been looking at those cross-references and kind of like weaving them into the text.
Wait, and again, that added verse, it's not in the Dead Sea Scrolls either.
Okay, getting more and more interesting. What else?
Okay, let's look at Isaiah chapter 2, verses 10, 19, and 21. In his commentary, Clarke points out that the phrase, "when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth," is missing from verse 10, but it's in verses 19 and 21. And he bases this on his comparison of different ancient translations of Isaiah.
Okay. And what does the Book of Mormon do with this?
In 2 Nephi 12, verse 10, it adds the phrase, "O ye wicked ones," it keeps "enter into the rock," and it adds, "shall smite thee." And then it also adds "shall smite thee" into verses 19 and 21. It's like it's trying to smooth out that discrepancy that Clarke pointed out by adding similar language to the verse where it was missing.
Like it's responding to Clarke's observation. And what about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, get this. They don't even have Isaiah chapter 2, verse 10 at all. It's just not there, which suggests that this verse might have been added to the text later on, and yet Joseph Smith not only includes this potentially later addition, but he adds even more to it.
Wow. Okay, so far, the Book of Mormon seems to be lining up pretty consistently with Clarke's commentary, even when it goes against what we find in the oldest manuscripts. What else is there?
Okay, let's look at another example. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. In his commentary, Clarke says that the imagery of high mountains, lofty hills, cedars of Lebanon, and oaks of Bashan, it all represents political powers, like kingdoms, republics, states, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's symbolic language.
Right. And in 2 Nephi 12, verse 14, after listing those same natural features, it adds the phrase, "upon all the nations." So it's making that connection to political entities explicit, just like Clarke did.
And again, not in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Nope. So once again, we have the Book of Mormon aligning with Clarke's specific interpretation, even though it's not reflected in the oldest textual witnesses.
Okay, what about some other examples? We're on a roll here.
Well, let's look at Isaiah chapter 9, verse 3. The KJV translates it as, "Thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased the joy." But Clarke says, based on his research, that the word "not" should be removed. So it should read, "Thou hast increased their joy." And guess what? The Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi 19, verse 3, it says, "and increased the joy." No, not, just like Clarke suggested.
Wow, another direct match.
But here's where it gets a little tricky. In this case, the Dead Sea Scrolls actually agree with Clarke in the Book of Mormon. The Great Isaiah Scroll, it reads something like, "You have expanded the nation, you increased its joy." So this time, Clarke's interpretation actually turns out to be more accurate based on the oldest evidence we have.
So it's not always a case of Clarke being wrong and the Book of Mormon following his mistake. Sometimes he gets it right, and the Book of Mormon seems to be following his correct interpretation. Okay, any more?
Oh yeah, we have more. Isaiah 14, verse 3. The KJV translates it as, "and it shall come to pass that in the day that," but Clarke, he suggests a slight rephrasing, "and it shall come to pass in that day." And wouldn't you know it, the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi chapter 24, verses 3 and 4, it uses Clarke's exact phrasing, "and it shall come to pass in that day."
And is this supported by the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Nope. So another case where the Book of Mormon sides with Clarke against the older manuscripts.
Okay, you mentioned one more example.
Isaiah chapter 14, verse 32. The KJV has, "What shall one then answer the messengers of the nation?" Notice it's singular, nation. But Clarke says it should be plural, nations. And guess what? The Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi 24, verse 32, It uses nations, plural, just like Clarke.
And what about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
They have the singular nation, so again, Book of Mormon agreeing with Clarke, not the oldest texts.
Okay, so this is getting pretty hard to ignore. There's all this evidence pointing to Adam Clarke as a potential source for the Book of Mormon, and I know you mentioned earlier that Townsend also noticed something about the phrase House of Israel. What's up with that?
Yeah, this is another one of those subtle but telling details.
Yeah.
Townsend points out that House of Israel pops up way more often in the Book of Mormon than it does in the actual Book of Isaiah, and it's often added in places where it wasn't originally there.
So, like, Joseph Smith is kind of emphasizing that theme.
Right, and guess what? That's totally in line with Adam Clarke's commentary. He's really big on the idea of the gathering of Israel. He talks about it all the time. It's like a major theme for him.
So it's like the Book of Mormon is picking up on that theme and amplifying it.
Exactly. And just to add another layer to all of this, we have to remember that Isaiah chapter 29 was really important to Joseph Smith. Like, there's that whole story about Martin Harris taking some characters from the Book of Mormon to Charles Anthon, and Anthon supposedly recognizing them as Egyptian or something.
Right.
And those characters, they were supposedly from Isaiah 29. So it makes sense that if Joseph Smith was consulting commentaries, he would have been especially interested in what Clarke had to say about Isaiah 29.
Makes total sense. Okay, so it seems pretty clear that something's going on here. These parallels between Clarke's commentary and the Book of Mormon, they're just too numerous and too specific to be coincidental. But it's also not like Joseph Smith was just straight up copying Clarke word for word.
Yeah, you're right. Townsend makes a really good point about that. He says that Joseph Smith's engagement with Clarke was more than just plagiarism. Like, there are places where he changes things, ignores things, even misunderstands things.
More like picking and choosing, reinterpreting.
Exactly. And we have to remember that people back then, they didn't always read things in a linear, systematic way like we do today. They would jump around, focus on certain parts, and kind of build their own meaning out of it.
Right, so it's not like Joseph Smith was trying to create a perfect copy of Clarke's commentary. He was using it as one of many sources, drawing on ideas, weaving them together, and creating his own unique text.
Exactly. And I think that's actually a really important point. It shows that the Book of Mormon, it was very much a product of its time. It wasn't just this like timeless, unchanging revelation. It was shaped by the intellectual and religious currents that were swirling around in the early 1800s.
Okay, so all of this is super interesting to me, and probably to a lot of our listeners. But for people who are skeptical about the Book of Mormon, who maybe question its divine authenticity, what are the implications of all this? Why should they care about these textual connections?
It's a great question, and here's why it matters. If the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages are so closely aligned with the interpretations of a 19th century scholar, especially when those interpretations differ from older, more reliable sources like the Dead Sea Scrolls, it really calls into question that whole idea of a pristine, perfectly preserved ancient record. It suggests that maybe the Book of Mormon isn't quite as ancient or as divinely inspired as it claims to be.
It's like if it's reflecting the ideas of a 19th century commentator, maybe it's also a product of the 19th century, not some ancient civilization.
Right. And for skeptics, this kind of evidence, it's really compelling. It points to the possibility that Joseph Smith was drawing on the resources he had around him, including contemporary biblical scholarship, to create the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so to wrap up this fascinating deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day?
Well, first, we have this undeniable overlap between Adam Clarke's commentary and the Book of Mormon, especially in the Isaiah sections. And it's not just general similarity, it's specific phrases, interpretations, even translation choices that align.
And these overlaps, they often happen when Clarke's interpretations differ from what we find in older, more reliable manuscripts like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. And all of this has to be understood in the context of the time, this time of intense biblical scrutiny, a desire for a purer form of Christianity, and lots of debate about the Bible and its interpretation. A time, by the way, when we know that Joseph Smith and his associates were actually using Bible commentaries.
So it all adds up to this pretty convincing picture that Adam Clarke's commentary might have been a significant source for the Book of Mormon.
It definitely seems that way.
So here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder as they go about their day. If the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages are so closely connected to the interpretations of a 19th century scholar, what does that tell us about the origins of the book itself? And what does it mean for its claim to be a divinely inspired translation of an ancient record? It's a big question, and there's no easy answer.
It's a question worth thinking about. And if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out Adam Clarke's commentary. It's a massive work, but it's
Mm.
fascinating stuff. And there's a ton of research out there on the Isaiah problem and the textual history of the Book of Mormon. So if you're curious, dive in and see what you find.
Always more to learn.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.